It's my pleasure to introduce the third and final story we are honoring tonight. It's a series of commentaries by Stephen Henderson from the Detroit Free Press, who won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. On July 18, 2013, Detroit became the largest US city to declare bankruptcy. In the period that followed, during that period, Stephen Henderson became the voice that was heard by all who had a stake in that historic process: state officials, city officials, judges, and most of all, the people of New York. As editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press, Stephen has concentrated his firepower on the problems of bankrupt Detroit, a once great city neglected for decades. Not content to publish editorials on the editorial page, he often wrote hard-hitting page-one columns that stirred reaction. Stephen is Detroit-born and bred, although he's had stints as a journalist in DC, Baltimore, and Chicago. In 2013, his mission was this: draw from his own experience growing up in Detroit, understand what it's like to live in neighborhoods that now have such high levels of crime and low levels of public services that they have become unlivable, and then help citizens figure out a path forward. His goal was simple: make lives better for Detroiters. Stephen's writing was passionate, but also nuanced. In one column, he wrote, in the midst of the blame throwing about the state of the city, he said, "No one factor drove Detroit's decline. No one person cast the city's fortunes or doomed its future. It was the confluence of a great many things over a spectacular span of time." Stephen also went against the grain. While the Free Press editorial board takes a liberal stand, Stephen was not afraid to support an emergency financial manager who was opposed by most of the city's Democratic leaders. He also eloquently supported the decision to file for bankruptcy in the midst of protests. When the Free Press team dug into the city's financial records and published a definitive series entitled "How Detroit Went Broke," Stephen built on their research to confront the accusation that the city's African-American political leaders caused its decline. Simple taglines and slogans don't explain Detroit's financial difficulties, he said. For eschewing simplistic slogans and being a passionate but rational voice, Stephen was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. So Stephen, how did you end up playing this role as the interlocutor of Detroit politics?
That's actually a really long question, or it has a long answer. I mean, I came home to Detroit in 2007 after about 12 years away. I was born there and grew up there, and went to the University of Michigan and was a young intern at the paper and then a young reporter at the paper. But then I left in 1995. There was a terrible newspaper strike in Detroit that sent a lot of people away, including me. But I always said I'd come home, that doing the kind of journalism I like to do would mean the most to me in the city where I was born. And I made good on that in 2007 when the paper called and said that they would like me to come and help lead the editorial page. I came home, and the first column I wrote was, the first line I wrote in a column was about how I might be insane for having left Washington in a very cushy job covering the Supreme Court to come back to a city and a state that were in awful, awful condition. People in Washington looked at me like I was crazy when I said I was going home. And of course, I was rewarded for that statement by watching that city and that state really experience an incredible low over the last 7 years. The first thing that happened was that our mayor, who at the time was a man named Kwame Kilpatrick, somebody I had known almost since early childhood, and was a real beacon of hope for the city, sort of embroiled in a major sex scandal that blossomed into a federal RICO case and sent him off to federal prison. Then, of course, the auto companies that sustained Detroit financially for the last 50 or 60, 70 years had to file bankruptcy and reorganize. And then the city itself hit this tremendous low. And it really is, it's wonderful timing, I think, in some ways, that I got back when I did and was able to sort of adopt that voice. But it's also not coincidence. I mean, I always said that the most important work I would do would be in the city of Detroit.
How difficult it is to be writing about your own city, about people, as you said, you've known from childhood, about neighborhoods you've grown up in.
Yeah, I mean, that's very difficult. I mean, I say all the time, I'm not just a public observer of the things that I'm writing about. I'm a personal witness to them. I'm a personal witness to the city's decline and the number of people who've moved away, and then the people who've stayed and the suffering that they endure. I live in the city. I'm raising 2 children in the city, so all of the choices that we have to make about safety and education and just basic services, those get made around my kitchen table as much as they get made anywhere else. And so I think that drives a lot of the passion that I have in the work, and it means something to me that goes far beyond the newspaper or far beyond journalism. Obviously, you have to be careful not to over-personalize it, but I think one of the real strengths of being from Detroit is that I have the sort of credibility and authority to speak as a Detroiter, not to speak for Detroiters. I'm very careful not to arrogate quite that much, but to speak as a Detroiter, as somebody who's experiencing the same things that everybody else is and wants things to get better because I need them to be better. I need them to be better for me and my family as much as the other families who live there.
I mean, you live in a city with a long and troubled history of racial politics. Do people see you as representing a particular community or a particular point of view?
I think there's no question that I get, I get pigeonholed sometimes as an African American voice in Detroit, and there are expectations that come with that, and sometimes I disappoint those expectations. There are also times when I am proud to sort of meet the expectations of being an African American voice in a city that's led and populated by an African American majority. That's sort of a tough thing to endure. I actually had a conversation with a friend over the weekend about this last 5 years in this job and how different it has been for me. I'm the first African American editorial page editor at the Free Press, and this person was telling me how difficult it looks from the outside to do the job in the city and have to bear that burden in addition to the other leadership roles. It's not something that I try to wear on my sleeve, but it's something that I'm always aware of.
What were the best and worst responses you've gotten from readers? I mean, you wrote a column, you wrote a column mocking protesters for blocking a highway, saying they should have better things to do, like picking up trash or volunteering in recreation centers. I mean, what kind of response did you get to that?
I got a lot of blowback from that. I mean, there were people who pointed out that they were activists and that they do pick up trash, or that they have spent a lot of time working in neighborhoods trying to build community. And of course, I wasn't talking about them. I was talking about the people who are, one of the great sort of mysteries, I think, of Detroit is how we as Detroiters have come to accept less in terms of services, less in terms of competence, less in terms of just about everything. I have always sort of prided myself on trying to identify the voice of reason as the most underrepresented voice in Detroit. It's not the voice of African Americans or the poor. It's the voice of logic and of sort of considered thought. And I try to stick to that, and I try to stay out of a lot of the more pugnacious arguments and discussions that go on, because I think they help reinforce that idea that we don't have solutions or that we can't get past where we are, and sort of removing ourselves from that is the path forward.
So does the voice of reason sell?
I think it does. I get a lot of positive feedback from people who believe that that's what's missing. That's what's often missing in the dialogue, and that's what's missing in the discussion about leadership. And among leaders in the city, that so often we have made the irrational decision or the emotional decision, and that's what led us to this incredible low. And it's a low of finance. The dictionary definition of the low of finance is bankruptcy, but it's also a cultural and social low in the city. I mean, the very first column I wrote about the prospect of bankruptcy talked about fire trucks getting to houses too late before they could burn to the ground, ambulances showing up long after people can be helped. These are the lows that we live with every day, and that I try to sort of get us to think we deserve better. We deserve better, and we can get better.
Great. So I think we have someone who's eager to ask a question here. Yes.
Mr. Henderson, how do you muster the courage to take these controversial stands and take on the fierce criticism that you may occasionally face for that? How do you muster that courage? That's my question.
I always think when I'm writing about, I think about the city and growing up in the city and the incredible attachment that I have to the city. I come from a family that was deeply involved in union politics in the city. First, the expansion of African American leadership in the unions in the late 50s, early 60s is what brought my family to Detroit. I grew up with political leaders in my family who helped build it into the place that I remember, that I can picture very easily from the 1970s. That gives me an incredible amount of courage. I mean, that gives me an incredible amount of authority. I feel like that I am a son of the city in a way that not many other people can claim to be. In addition, I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't say that all the other experiences I had also give me that incredible courage. I mean, if I had stayed in Detroit after the strike in 1995 and been there for the last 20 years, I think I would have a very different point of view about those things, and I would have less to sort of build on. The time I spent some time in Kentucky writing about coal mines and going into coal mines. I've seen that story up close. I spent time in Chicago looking at schools there and learning about helped the Chicago Tribune build its first website back in the late 1990s. And I spent 5 terms covering the U.S. Supreme Court and learning about the law, learning about judging and argument and things like that. All of those things feed into the work that I do every day, and they give me courage. I mean, I think the things I've learned from those experiences make me feel more like I do have a strong and authoritative voice, and less likely to back down when people push back against it.
So another question for Stephen. Yes.
Good evening. I was interested in this question anyway, but it seems especially relevant given what you said about being the first African-American editorial page editor at the Free Press, and also the pigeonholing you felt because of that sometimes. What do you think is added by using your byline and photograph with these pieces as opposed to just having unsigned editorials like most papers might?
That's a wonderful question. I think that's a question that every editorial page editor is facing around the country right now. The decline in credibility that's associated with institutions that I think we see play out all the time in social media, I think is really driving us to think really hard about when that institutional voice has weight and when it needs to be what we put out front, and when somebody's personal voice is what can carry us. I think in this specific case, there was no question that that because I am a Detroiter, and because I care so deeply about the city, and our readers know that, they knew that before the bankruptcy, that putting my face and my name out front made the most sense. But in other contexts, we struggle with that all the time. I mean, I don't know what the future of the institutional voice looks like or how often it needs to be used. I know, for instance, it'll always have to be used with endorsements, political endorsements. That shouldn't come from a person. That should come from the institution. There are lots of other cases where in 10, 15 years ago, we absolutely would have used that institutional voice, where now we use a person, a column. People, you think about the way we interact on social media, it's always person to person. There's always somebody associated with the thought or the feeling that's being expressed, and so people come to expect that, and I think they're coming to expect that from media organizations as well. We've started taking to joking on my staff that the institutional voice is like the daddy voice, right? The thing you bring out when you're really mad and you're scolding somebody, which tells you something about its anachronistic nature as well. I don't know that it has as much of a future as I think other people would argue it does. I think we get more done as individuals representing the institution than we do speaking in that sort of anonymous institutional voice.
Thank you.
Is someone else going to ask a question? Was there someone? Okay, yes, very quickly, please, yeah.
You compare your time as a Detroiter, and you say that they come to expect first. Do you share the same as member of the Afro-American community, knowing the whole bonanza of the past Detroit automobile industry and the Motown and so forth? Do you think that the situation of the present Afro-American community in Detroit have improved or have any future in Detroit as it is now?
I was born in 1970, and Coleman Young, who was the first African-American mayor of Detroit, was elected in 1973. So my life really is the story of the development of the sort of playing out of the maturity of black leadership in Detroit. I am always very careful to sort of affix a sort of nuanced filter to what that has meant for black people in Detroit and the African American community. I mean, things are not better now than they were in 1973 for black people in Detroit. You couldn't argue that in a million years. But there are a lot of reasons that's true, and most of them have nothing to do with the African American leadership that's been in place. I mean, I think The bankruptcy is an opportunity. It gets a lot of debt off our back. It makes government more nimble and able to address some of the problems that we see, particularly in our neighborhoods. I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Detroit, but it's absolutely worth a visit. There is no American city quite like it right now. I mean, you would never see the scale of devastation and abandonment like we have experienced over the last 40 years. I'm somewhat hopeful that things will get better. I think we have the opportunity to make them better. But the poverty, the economic isolation, the lack of good schools, those are the things that are driving the African American experience in neighborhoods right now. And if we can't address those things, and think about how many other cities struggle with those, we can't get things to be better. You know, I'm an African American. I live in the city. I'm raising 2 kids who are African American living in the city. I think that is part of the solution. We have got to get more African Americans who are educated and middle class to live in the city and invest in it and raise the level of services and economic opportunity available to the people who have been left behind. Detroit Story, a lot of people, I think, confuse Detroit Story with the story of white flight, that all the white people left for the suburbs and took money with them, which did happen. But the story of Detroit over the last 10 to 15 years has been economic flight. African Americans with means leaving the city and leaving poor people behind. We've got to reverse that trend, I think, if you're going to improve life for the people who are still there.